All right, welcome to our third winter webinar series with this week's topic being natural working lands with a focus on natural climate solutions and municipal opportunities. As we're letting a few people in, just want to wait about a minute or two to get going. And looks like everyone has made it in. All right, as we're starting, I just want to go over a few housekeeping rules. We just ask that everyone please remain on mute unless you're called upon to allow for the presenters to speak without interruption. And you might have heard that notification at the beginning of this. It is going to be recorded, the meeting, and it's going to be posted on the EEA's YouTube page. And we will also be sending it out in our newsletter as well, the links to it, so everyone can have it. While we're getting going, it'd be helpful if everyone could please introduce themselves in the chat with their first name, last name, and then also if you have an associated organization that you'd like to share as well. After our presentations, we are going to be having a Q&A on first the EEA side of things, and then also with our MVP case study. As people are presenting, you can feel free to ask a question in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will be, pulling all the questions together, and then we will answer them in two separate Q&As at the end. And then I also do want to take the opportunity. I missed out. My name is Patrick Ford, and I am the Deputy Manager of Public Engagement for Climate Solutions with the EEA. If anyone has additional questions after their webinar or is having trouble signing in right now or has a colleague that has trouble signing in, please email me at patrick.ford@mass.gov. So for today, our agenda is going to be short introductions, then our natural working lands sector background, focus on a few different sections, and then talking about the Forests Climate Initiative, and then really thinking about how it can specifically be useful for municipalities, all the different programs that we're going to talk about. Then we will shift to an MVP case study and also our Q&As. With that, I'm going to hand things off to my colleague, Han Chu.
Thank you, Patrick. Hi, everyone. My name is Han Chu, Global Warming Solutions Program Manager and Carbon Sequestration and Storage Policy Lead for EEA Climate Team. And thanks for having me, Patrick. I will use about 10-15 minutes to provide an overview of natural working lands, their role in achieving net zero, but then also strategies and goals for natural working lands related to climate. And then I'll hand it over to others in the environment team at EEA to present more specifically about policies and specific resources. So for the climate team, we're working really hard to achieve putting the policies and programs in place to achieve net zero, collaborating with colleagues in the environment team, as well as state agencies in our secretariat and others across the secretariat to decarbonize aggressively in the energy sectors, which includes the power generation and buildings and transportation, as well as industrial subsectors. And those are like efforts that help us severely aggressively decarbonize. So these blue wedges here in this image here represents the illustrative trajectory of our energy sectors down to at least 15% emissions below the 1990, at least 85% emissions reduction below the 1990 baseline. But in order to achieve net zero, we really do need to balance out what residual emissions will be in 2050. It will be very hard to achieve complete zero from now to 2050. And so it's very important that we figure out ways to, while aggressively decarbonizing ways to protect our natural working lands so they can serve the role of sequestering carbon from the atmosphere to balance out residual emissions in 2050. And so in this image here, like the blue wedges are the energy sectors, as I mentioned, but the natural working lands contribution to net zero is the green wedge at the bottom there towards the bottom of the graph, and that is right now at about 7.1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, which is offsetting current statewide emissions at about 10%. And we very much intend to protect this as much as we can, enhance it whenever possible, but acknowledge that there is a real possibility that we might not be able to have this level of carbon sequestration into 2050 due to many factors. And so that's something that we're working hard to identify, like how much of our sequestration from natural sources are happening now and how much we can protect in the future, but acknowledging that there is a lot of uncertainties now into 2050. Next slide, please. So in this, in the previous image, we see natural working lands as one wedge in the area graph, but within that one wedge, there's a lot of complexities that are inherent in our natural working lands. Complexities because these are natural systems, dynamic systems that have two-way a flow of carbon, right? Removal of carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis by our trees and shrubs and other vegetation, but then also emissions from natural working lands from anthropogenic sources like human activities, but then also from natural sources, for example, like wildfire, for example, or beaver activities, things like that. And so it's a lot of people, when we think about decarbonization, achieving net zero, think about like the other sectors and how it's transitioning our equipments to non-carbon emitting equipments, and it's kind of like a one-way flow of carbon reduction, but for natural working lands, it's like a two-way street. And so that's something that we have to keep in mind of. And so that negative 7.1 million metric tons, that's the net value for the entire state. Looking into the specific land cover types, we have like forests that are on a net basis sequestering more than they emit. And right now, in 2021, our estimate shows that we have about 5.8 million metric tons of sequestration, so negative emissions from our forests. They are serving as the biggest sequester of carbon in the Commonwealth. And there is some small emissions associated with that, but on a net basis, they are removing more than emitting. There are other land cover types, such as sediments and in wetlands and croplands and grasslands. Sediments are land cover types that cover both like impervious surfaces, but then also open space in urban and non-urban, suburban areas. Things like parks, urban trees, open forests. And so they also are emitting, but on a net basis, they are sequestering more due to more than they're emitting, and that's due to the trees in our open space. And then for I'll get to wetlands next. For croplands and grasslands, they cover a small percentage of the state. Only 7% of Massachusetts are croplands and grasslands. And on average, on an annual basis, there's a small emissions associated with it, but very small, like less than, right here, about 0.3 million metric tons. So one of the smallest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the state. But they provide a multitude of other ecosystem benefits, such as like food for us, but then also other for grasslands, like other wildlife habitats. And for wetlands, I want to cover this last is because they, while cover a relatively small percentage of Massachusetts, 11%, they store a lot of carbon on a per unit basis. Right here, 920 metric tons of carbon are stored on a per acre basis in our wetlands. And they're important, not so much sequester, because they sequester carbon more slowly than forests, for example, but they're important because they store carbon in making sure that the carbon stays stored in our wetlands. And so these are the 4 main land cover types in Massachusetts. And you can see like the a spatial extent of them in the graph to the left. And each of them represents key land cover types, and as well as have important services that they provide. And so the strategies to protecting them and to managing them and restoring them are quite unique. Next slide, please. So I mentioned before that the strategies to protect each of our land cover types, main land cover types, are unique in for each of them, but all totaled, that as a collective, it's very important that we protect all of our natural working lands from degradation and from conversion, so that they can remain natural working lands, allow forests to remain forests, so they continue to sequester carbon, as well as provide other ecosystem benefits, such as wildlife habitat, cooling for urban areas, as well as water quality, and for wetlands as well, protecting them so that we avoid further emissions from wetlands, and that we keep them as carbon storage. For manage, it's also important that we manage a lot of the natural working lands, particularly forests and farms, so that they can be resilient to climate change that are impacting our everyday lives. And so we will talk a little more about like the climate oriented management, particularly for forests later on in this presentation. But it's in our perspective, it's very important that we first protect and then we manage them in a way so that they continue to be resilient in the face of climate change. And then the third strategy here is that in addition to protecting our natural working lands, making sure that they're healthy and resilient, there are degraded areas that will need to be restored, especially, for example, wetlands that might have been tidally restricted, or wetlands that have been impacted by water quality issues that also impact the release of carbon. So it's important that we restore a lot of our degraded natural working lands so that they can function as natural working lands, but also continue to have that natural balance of carbon sequestration and storage. And this strategy restore also includes reforesting, also include tree planting in urban and riparian areas. And so this strategy covers both degraded areas, restoring them to be less degraded and to be in more natural state, but then also like expanding the extent of our natural working lands through reforestation and afforestation. And then the fourth strategy here is recognizing that to achieve net zero, we not only protect what we have in state, but we likely will probably have to explore additional carbon sequestration that is beyond the capacity of our natural working lands. And so that's something that we it's a longer term strategy, something that we're keeping an eye on as we get a better sense of how much we can expect from our natural working lands in terms of carbon sequestration and storage into the future. So for each of these strategies that we put in the clean energy and climate plans for 2025, 2030, 2050, we also identified like key goals that we like to achieve in the next few decades. Goals for protect goals such as protecting permanently 28% of Massachusetts by 2025, 30% by 2030, and 40% by 2050. Goals for manage include 20 committing to having 20% of privately owned forests and farms, non-state forests and farms, adopting climate smart practices by 2030, as well as having a 5% improvement between 2025 and 2030 in durable wood products recovery of harvested timber. So making sure that for any removal of trees, that as much of the carbon in those trees remains stored in wood products as much as possible. And then for our restore strategy, the goals here is that we want to plant a lot of urban trees and riparian trees. So 5,000 acres of new riparian and urban trees by 2025. We have the goal of 16,100 acres by 2030, as well as 64,400 acres by 2050. And so these are quite ambitious goals, and the Secretary is working hard to making sure that we can line up resources to meet these goals. And in addition to tree planting, we have the goal of like no net loss of carbon storage in wetlands. Right now, there's no net loss of wetlands in our policies, but this goal is saying, how can we make sure that in addition to having no net loss of wetlands in acres, but making sure that we don't have net loss in the carbon that is stored in the wetlands themselves. So next slide, please. Okay, great. So to implement these strategies, these 4 strategies, and achieve the goals that we set out for ourselves, policy action goals that we have set out for ourselves, we have a host of programs and initiatives, too many to list on here, but I do list some of the more key ones. And so these are the Resilient Lands Initiative, and a very important initiative that began I think 3 or 4 years ago, and it focuses on how it began 3 or 4 years ago and culminated into a report that was released in January 2023 last year. And so it focuses on how the forests, farms, parks, and other open spaces across Massachusetts can help improve the quality of life for residents, especially residents of environmental justice neighborhoods. The Resilient Lands Initiative report and its implementation through the environment team and through Bob Wilbur specifically, who will speak later, is aimed at conserving, restoring, and caring for natural working lands to help both nature and people. The other initiative here that Kurt Geithner will talk in detail about is the Forest as Climate Solutions Initiative. It's a multi-pronged effort by the Healy administration to implement forest components of natural working land strategies in the Commonwealth's clean energy and climate plans, as well as the Resilient Lands Initiative. The third initiative here that wanted to briefly mention, but you'll hear a lot more about it soon, is that Governor Healy issued Executive Order 618 last September, directing the Department of Fish and Game to develop biodiversity conservation goals for 2030, 2040, and 2050. These goals and strategies, including for coastal and marine biodiversity, will halt and reverse the variety of species and habitats of Massachusetts. The department is working really hard to develop these goals and metrics, and they will provide more information and get feedback on this effort in the coming weeks and months. And then the fourth thing I wanted to mention is that in our Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2025 and 2030, we put in there a commitment to dedicate a portion of the MVP action grants, up to $3 million a year, for greening and nature-based projects to increase carbon storage and urban cooling. And so I'm hopeful that a lot of you and your colleagues in other municipalities are taking advantage of this and thinking about like projects that both increase carbon, but also have climate resilience benefits as well. Kurt and Bob will talk more about the grants and resources for natural working land conservation, climate-oriented management, and restoration. I'll just mention that the next bullet is like, I'll mention that as part of the Forest as Climate Solutions Initiative, there's going to be a forum, Forest Climate Innovations Forum, coming up in March 2021. March 21 of this year. And this forum is meant for landowners, both private and municipal landowners, as well as forest businesses, forest industry participants and partners, for us to get together and talk about like the climate impacts to our forests, but then also how do we use our forests for climate mitigation and resilience services. And so there's going to be workshops and sessions talking about like what is climate forestry, as well as workshops talking about like incentives and new offerings for landowners to practice climate smart forest management, as well as incentives for businesses and resources for businesses to make sure that our forests meet our solutions through wood products, innovative wood products to help with climate change. And so I hope to see many of you there. It's going to be held at UMass Amherst, and registration is open now. You can, I can put the link in the chat after I finish with this slide. And then two more things I just wanted to briefly mention. In addition to all the wonderful things that we are doing to implement policies and getting resources out to you all and to others, we are also having putting a lot of investments in better understanding the carbon storage and sequestration potential of our natural working lands. So one study that we have been working on and we'll finish up later this year is the forest carbon study, assessing how much of our forests can continue to sequester and store carbon to the future given climate change impacts, as well as invasive outbreaks, as well as in response to like key strategies to help improve forest management and improve siting of solar and housing and reforestation efforts. So that study is going to be released relatively soon, later this year. And then another study is the no-net loss of wetlands carbon study that Mass DEP is doing, and they are assessing like what is the extent of our wetlands in Massachusetts. So getting better mapping of wetlands in Massachusetts, but then also getting a better sense of like the carbon storage in each of these wetlands, and combing through the latest science and then providing policy recommendations on how best we protect the carbon in our wetlands. So those are two studies that will be released later this year, so more to come. With that, I will hand it over to Kurt Geithner.
Good morning, everyone. Kurt Geithner, Assistant Secretary for Environmental Policy at Energy and Environmental Affairs. For this portion of this morning's webinar, I'm going to be joined by Bob Wilbur, the Director of Division of Conservation Services, also at Energy and Environmental Affairs. The two of us have been very involved with the Forest as Climate Solutions Initiative, and we're going to be working with you to go over the agenda you see on this slide in front of you, talking to you about the initiative and the motivation for it, the goals, the various aspects of the initiative, or the branches you see in the middle of this slide, and then covering the recommendations or outcome of a committee we convened to advise us, and talking in depth on two different topics: land conservation and the role municipalities, I understand, and I've been looking at the participants, many of you representing municipalities, might play a role in. And then finally, we're also going to talk about land management and the role municipalities and others might play in managing lands with climate or forest as climate solutions in mind. Next slide, please. Mm. All right,
Sorry
there
about
we
that,
go.
Kurt.
No worries. Got me concerned there for a second, but we seem to be. All right. So the initiative was announced back in June. We've been at this since then. And you can see underlined in this portion of language from the press release, the main motivation to ensure that Massachusetts forests are managed to optimize carbon sequestration and mitigate climate harms. Knowing that we have a lot of purposes for our forests, they serve many purposes, and that there's a lot that goes into that. We're going to talk about programs, incentives, land management techniques, land conservation, all of which recognize the importance of forests to us and our objectives, and that are informed by the latest climate science. We really, as part of the administration, wanted to be sure that we were working with the latest science and that we were incorporating that into our approach to forest land management. Next slide, please. By way of background, of course, we are working toward objectives, obligations that have been set for us. The Global Warming Solutions Act, for example, requires us to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions, as Han covered in the graphic in the earlier slide, in 2050. And in order to achieve that, we have issued a series of plans. You can see on this slide, the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2050. And summarized from it some of the key recommendations that pertain to forests and forest land management. Perhaps the most important, the first one, really important to retain forests as forests if we are to achieve our greenhouse gas goals and rely on forests for that objective. In addition to expand restoration and management, the management of lands is also very important to achieving this, and one of the motivations behind the initiative. And we also want to do the other things you see on here, encourage more use of durable wood products and the sequestration that comes from that, and also to help with the viability of our forest-based businesses in the forest economy. Next slide, please. The forests of Massachusetts are particularly important. Just by volume, just by landscape, of Massachusetts, roughly 5.1 million acres, about 57% of the Commonwealth is forested. So we're one of the most forested states despite a relatively high population density. Of the roughly 3 million acres of forests, about 1.9 million are held by private parties, and then about 1 million by the public, by cities and towns, and by the Commonwealth. In fact, about half of the land held by public entities is owned by the Commonwealth, and about half by other entities such as municipalities. Another important thing you can see in this graphic on the right-hand side of this slide, this is carbon density. So the darker the orange, the more carbon there is present on the landscape. As you can see, the western portions of the Commonwealth, and then an arc going to southern New Hampshire and Vermont, is the most carbon intensive portion of the New England landscape. This says something about the management that has been taking place in the Commonwealth and these other regions. Yes, and Central, I see the comment, correct. Don't want to leave you out. In any event, lots of carbon on the landscape speaks to the importance of management and to the value of the forests to our climate objectives. Next slide, please. So, turning to the initiative itself, we broke our work up into what we called, of course, branches. And so to begin, the first branch of the initiative had to do with climate-oriented forest management guidelines. These pertain to, most specifically, how the state manages the 525,000 or so acres that are under the management of either the Division of State Parks and Recreation or Water Supply Protection at DCR, or the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. And we wanted to take a look, make certain that the management approaches we were employing were done with climate in mind and the latest science relative to the intersection between land management and climate. So what we did was to work with a climate forestry committee of experts, I'll share a slide on in a minute, to look at the latest science, to look at management guidelines. And we also paused active forest management on state lands for a period of time in order to consider those recommendations. We've now, as I'll come to, the work of the Climate Forestry Committee is complete, and we are working to consider the recommendations made. Next slide, please. The second branch of the Forest's Climate Solutions Initiative has to do with making sure that we keep as many intact forests as possible. Part of this is land conservation. One of the objectives of the Clean Energy and Climate Plan is to double the pace of land conservation, achieve 40% conserved by 2050. That is a way of ensuring ourselves carbon on the landscape and the benefits that come with all of those forests, in addition to climate concerns, but also to reduce land conversion. We really, much as we need housing production, much as we need clean energy, want to produce those things in ways that reduce land consumption and provide them with as little conversion as possible. And finally, the initiative also calls for expanding forest reserves. We presently have about 150,000 acres of reserves, largely on lands held by the Department of Conservation and Recreation. The initiative calls for taking a look at those and potentially expanding those reserves, areas where we are essentially looking to let the nature largely take its course and be more passive in our management for carbon, habitat, and other benefits. Next slide, please. The third aspect of the initiative, or branch, I'm going to talk in depth on this one later, has to do with incentives, supporting landowners, businesses, and rural communities. Because about 2/3 of forest land is held by parties other than the public or other than the Commonwealth, we want to make sure that there are incentives, encouragement, tools, resources for municipalities that own forest land and for others to manage them in ways that help us advance climate-oriented forestry. And we also have some programs intended to support forest-based businesses and rural communities, recognizing the importance of those businesses to the economy of the Commonwealth and to achieving our land management objectives. Next slide. Finally, the fourth branch of the initiative, one in which Han has been very involved, is data integrating and making the best science available, public, and in use. So we are expanding our ability to monitor forests in the Commonwealth through the continuous forest inventory and other methods. We're going to be making more of the information on forests and climate change available through a dashboard, and we are going to be making it easier and more public to find out what we're doing relative to land management on the holdings of the Commonwealth. Next slide, please. As to the forest management guidelines and making sure that we are considering the latest climate science, we convened a group of a dozen experts. You can see them on the right-hand side of this slide. And we really tried to convene a group that represented a balanced perspective and the right kind of diverse expertise on forests and forest land management to advise us on how to incorporate climate change into our management approach. So the goals, you can see the charge to the committee on the left-hand side there, define goals and objectives for climate-oriented forestry, evaluate best practices and advise us on the science supporting them, assess the practices in place and recommend others as appropriate, and ultimately develop recommendations for climate-oriented management guidelines to be implemented through land management on state properties, and that we would encourage others to adopt through incentives and other programs. Next slide, please. So what did they recommend? I guess, first of all, covered on the next slide, but I'll talk about it now. The committee has issued its report in January and provided about 60 pages of advice on a variety of topics, including climate-oriented forest management that you see here. First of all, in regard to passive management, say reserve style, where you're largely leaving forests, nature to manage forests, or active management, where we are taking a direct role in managing the composition of forests. The committee suggested, well, there's roles for both. They did say, however, that passive management does lead to more carbon accumulation on the landscape, which we certainly are considering. At the same time, we also need to achieve other land management objectives, such as provision of habitat and other goals. In regard to natural disturbances, when we do manage actively, they encourage us to mimic natural cycles. And they focused a fair amount of space on limiting post-salvage disturbance salvage, that leaving dead wood in the forests when it was down by, say, a windstorm or ice storm or something of that nature, had a positive effect on forest structure, carbon, and soil benefits, and they encouraged us to do less post-disturbance tree salvage. In regard to carbon storage, I've already mentioned that they suggested allowing forests to grow and age is best to maximize carbon storage, but there are rationales for which we will be pursuing active forest management, such as provision of habitat, and they suggested strategies when we are doing that active management to take carbon and climate change into account. For example, retaining more of the mature trees on a site as a management project is undertaken. Resilience. Managing forest for resilience was one of the areas where there was a difference of views among the 12 members of the committee. Some felt that active management is really important to diversify tree species and age in order to increase resilience. So if you have a wide variety of tree ages and a wide variety of tree species, it stands to reason you're likely to have more resilience among those different ages and classes. Others felt that, well, no, yes, the diversity is important, but let nature take care of that. Let nature address resilience through the storms that we would occur anyway, rather than through agencies and others manipulating the landscape to achieve diversity. Finally, managing for habitat. They recommended that we consider, given the carbon implications, a reduced goal for early successional habitat. And then, as you can imagine, since this covers a lot of length, there are other topics: soils, pests and pathogens, invasive plants, public water supply. Next slide, please. Since I can't possibly cover all of that today, I would recommend that you review the document itself. It is posted on the Forest Climate Solutions webpage for everyone to review. In addition to forest land management, the committee also offered recommendations on the other branches of the initiative, things like forest conservation and forest reserves, landowner and business incentives, which I'll talk about in a minute, and then the variety of other things you can see on this slide. Next slide, please. So this gets to the Climate Forestry Committee and where we are. The Forest Committee's work is done. They've provided our report. We put it out for public comment on January 3rd and took comment through January 24th, although honestly, the comment box is still open, although the stream of comments has slowed. And through January 24th, we had received somewhere around 105 or 110 comments on the recommendations of the committee. And at this point, the agencies are working on a public response to the committee's recommendations. What are we, EEA, and the agencies that manage forest land going to do with these recommendations? How will they be incorporated into our forest management practices, our existing plans and new ones as we produce them? And how are we going to be transparent about how our projects and individual land management activities put into practice those recommendations? In addition, we had paused projects. We are now looking at those projects and applying the guidelines. The idea would be that we issue our response to the recommendations and proceed with the projects at the time we issue that response. We are now looking to get that response out as quickly as we can. We had originally thought perhaps the end of this month, which is very soon now. And so we're looking at it to be sometime in March rather than this month, but we are working away at this and do expect to issue a response and to move ahead with projects in the near term. Next slide, please. So next steps, we're working away at the branches of the initiative, looking at both public and private ownerships. We are working on implementation of the guidelines and recommendations. We are looking at reserve expansion on public and private lands. As Bob can speak to, we are looking to accelerate land protection to get to that 40% by 2050. We have set aside $50 million for land acquisition related to this, as well as for incentives and other aspects of the initiative. We're going to continue to monitor and follow the science and continue public and stakeholder engagement, such as the webinar we're doing today. Next slide, please. And with that, my colleague, Bob Wilbur, is going to speak now to the second branch, or the land conservation aspect of Forest's Climate Solutions. Bob. Bob, you're muted.
Thank you, Kurt, and good morning, everyone. Good to be with you this morning. As Han and Kurt both referenced, protecting natural working lands is a key strategy in achieving the bold but essential goals outlined in the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2030 and 2050. Thankfully, Massachusetts has a long history of very impactful land conservation, and a term I use quite a bit is the land conservation community. And when I speak of the land conservation community, I'm talking about state environmental agencies, municipal conservation stakeholders, and the land trust movement. That has been our strength here in Massachusetts for a long, long time. After all, the concept of conservation arguably began with the establishment of the Boston Common just over the hill from where I am right now, about 400 years ago. And then more recently, but still a long time ago, 135 years ago, with the birth of the land trust movement, which is now an international movement that began in our small state of Massachusetts in the 1890s. And that vibrant, impactful community is serving us well as we go about achieving these essential goals. So I have long believed that conservation at all levels is in Massachusetts is the pumps for that are primed by state funding flowing regularly and predictably and strategically to allow conservation to happen at all levels. And so accordingly, the Division of Conservation Services offers a wide array of grant opportunities. And those include the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Those grants are capped at $1 million each. Those can be used for acquisition or restoration, and they can be either for conservation or recreation. They're a federally sourced grant fund. So the only complication on that is the Yellow Book appraisal requirements that some of you will be familiar with. In terms of the strictly state grants, the park grant, that is formerly urban self-help for those of you who go back a little ways. And that's for acquiring recreation land and developing recreation facilities. Those grants are capped at $500,000, and look for that applications to be due for that in late spring, early summer. Similarly, the land grant program, formerly self-help, that is strictly for acquiring conservation land. That's also capped at $500,000 per grant, and applications will be due at the same time frame, late spring, early summer. Drinking water supply protection grants, those are capped at $350,000, and applications are due on March 18th. The Landscape Partnership Grant Program, that for any who might not be aware of that, the idea there was to incentivize conservation stakeholders to be pursuing the largest remaining conservation opportunities in their service areas. And we recently implemented a new statewide sliding scale, which has worked really, really well. So we now, once again, have conservation stakeholders, municipalities central to that, from the Cape to the Berkshires, pursuing the largest opportunities remaining in their areas. And the landscape partnership grants will be due, applications will be due on April 18th. And those require at least 2 partners from the following groups: municipal, land trust, and state or water or fire districts. Another grant that we have, this will be the second year for this grant, the Cranberry Bog Acquisition for Restoration Grant is a very exciting grant. We've had some terrific proposals funded through that grant program, very impactful. And so look for that one with applications due sometime in April. That is a up to 90% reimbursement grant and total grant award up to $2 million. The last one actually 2 more that I want to mention quickly. The Greening the Gateway Cities tree planting, as Han mentioned earlier. So there's there'll be a new grant program for riparian tree planting, and then a very important turn and shift in focus of the Greening the Gateway Cities tree planting program, shifting from what had been a focus on energy efficiency solely to now including a focus on public health and cooling within urban heat islands. And so that's a very, very exciting one. And with that shift, moving to things like microforests and removal of impervious cover. So that's another very, very exciting program in my view. And then one to look for coming soon is a capacity grant, especially for you municipal stakeholders on this webinar. I have long said that our municipal partners have great potential to do really big things in terms of conservation. What you don't have often is a lot of capacity because you have so many things that are pulling at your time. And so to try to address that, we've created a capacity grant that will allow municipalities or land trusts to hire consultants to advance land conservation projects, everything from drafting grant proposals to negotiating transactions and so on. So that has really good potential going forward. Next slide, please. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is the Massachusetts Resilient Lands Conservation Coalition. So the Resilient Lands Initiative is a very important public-private initiative, really intending to coordinate the actions of that conservation community that I referred to a moment ago, state agencies, municipalities, and land trusts in particular. Couple of key things about resilient lands conservation. One, it's not just about land protection, doing transactions. There was a deliberate elevation of ecological restoration and ecological management as being critical strategies to achieve the goals. The other important thing about RLI is that the actions identified within it are identified through the dual lenses of climate response and addressing environmental justice inequities. So within the 4 areas of coastal, farms and food, urban, landscape scale, and forest conservation, that's what the Resilient Lands Conservation Community Coalition rather is all about. We had our kickoff meeting for that in January in Westboro. And last comment, and this really goes back to something that Han said earlier. To achieve the clean energy and climate plan goals of 2030 and 2050, we will need to double the pace of our conservation actions. And that's why this type of coordination and this broad array of grant opportunities are so essential. And I'm an optimist at heart, so I'll leave you with this piece of it, and that is that we have operated at that level previously, back in around 2007. And so we know we can do this, and but we need everyone pulling in the same direction. Thanks very much.
Okay, next slide, please. I'm going to try and move through a couple of other things I was asked to cover quickly and give us some time for questions that I know are coming into the chat. Next, we were asked to cover management and incentives as part of the third branch support for forest landowners. And I think I would start with Forest Stewardship Program and Climate Planning from the Department of Conservation and Recreation. There is assistance available to private landowners, those of you who work for municipalities and manage conservation or town forest land or city forest parcels, as well as NGOs, and training available for foresters so that they are better able to advise all of those parties on land management practices, and then a set of resources I'm about to cover. Next slide, please. So, first of all, we would encourage all those that own forest land to complete a forest stewardship plan. Part of it is educational. Folks learn a lot about their land, learn a lot about management, and many set long-term management goals that turn out to be very helpful in the sense that when land management is performed, outcomes tend to be a lot better when there's a forest stewardship plan in place to guide that. There's a great deal of other reasons why one would perform or produce a forest stewardship plan. There's a variety of rationales to do it. Some popular approaches lately have to do with managing land, say for birds, if you're interested in that, for climate, of course, or combining multiple objectives within a forest management plan. Next slide, please. There are resources, funding available from the Department of Conservation and Recreation for these purposes. This slide outlines those. I know you'll be getting the slides afterward, but this speaks to resources available to communities interested in, or I shouldn't say community. Yeah, communities in this case, Community Forest Stewardship Program. This is funding to help municipalities with management and production of a forest stewardship plan. Next slide, please. We also have some publications we want to make you aware of. 3 of them here. You can see the covers. One related to helping landowners set goals for their property. The second one to help landowners address changing conditions. We are experiencing through climate change more frequent and intense storms, warmer temperatures, drought, and the like. This publication helps with that aspect. And then finally, as to managing forest for carbon, there's a publication intended for landowners focusing on that aspect of management as well. Next slide, please. There is a new program, a new incentive funding for this, for those interested in creating a climate-focused forest stewardship plan. Obviously, that's kind of the point of the Forest Climate Solutions Initiative. We would really like to see landowners managing with climate change in mind. It does help take site-specific aspects of this, does need to be site-specific. Topography, tree species, history of the land, all sorts of things go into creating a quality climate-oriented plan. And there is funding and assistance available to help landowners through professional forester assistance with these sorts of plans. Next slide, please. A program that is new, part of Forest Climate Solutions, is the Climate Stewardship Incentive Program, or CSIP. It's providing an incentive to landowners, funding to landowners to adopt and pursue some of these forest management practices. Appreciate the posting of the link. So that you can see the goals here. And then let's move on to the next slide to talk more specifically about the type of funding available. and again, I'm including these so that you can consider these at more depth with the slide deck. But there are 5 different varieties of funding available for practices associated with climate-oriented management. Better layout of roads and the like to avoid soil compaction and the impacts associated. Legacy tree retention, which the Climate Forestry Committee recommended as a particularly important thing. Invasive plant control, and then a number of climate-oriented or informed best management practices with more intense rainfall, for example. There are incentive payments here to help with forestry practices in the field that would reduce damage from runoff. There's details on this available on the Division of DCR's Working Forest Initiative webpage. Next slide, please. Contact information. There it is, including program details. Next slide, please. Finally, tree planting. I was asked to talk briefly about tree planting. Energy and Environmental Affairs and DCR offer 2 or 3 different approaches at present, and a couple are coming. First of all, for a long time, a decade or so now, we've been implementing something called the Greening the Gateway Cities Tree Planting Program. That involves DCR crews, 8 of them at present, operating in gateway cities across the Commonwealth. It also includes implementation and partnership grants to work in those gateway cities that nonprofits and the cities themselves are eligible for. We will shortly be launching a couple of new programs. One, riparian planting, and a second focused on addressing urban heat in that program. Both of those, riparian and heat associated, would be statewide programs focused on riparian planting and urban heat in particularly environmental justice populations or neighborhoods throughout the Commonwealth. Next slide, please. This speaks to the Greening the Gateway Cities program in some depth. So as I said, about 10 years, 2014. Initially, our primary goal was energy efficiency. We're now focusing on a number of other things like health and stormwater runoff. We hire, or DCR hires laborers locally. We've been working now in 23 of the 26 gateway cities. And over the past 10 years, we're now over 40,000 trees planted. And these are trees of some size, not saplings. So you can see an example of a crew planting a tree here in this slide. Next slide, please. These are a few details on the implementation and partnership grants. Implementation is intended to sort of complement tree planting by DCR crews or by others. You can see the various aspects of focus. We have a new one right in the middle there on the left-hand side, creation of microforests. We've come to appreciate that as an important and growing area of interest and want to highlight that one briefly. And then nonprofit partnership grants. It's very important for those in areas where tree planting is occurring to be familiar with, to have understand what's going on, to be engaged with this. And we've worked throughout the 10 years with partners at the local level to help us understand the neighborhood, work with the neighborhood in which we are tree planting. And that is a primary objective of the partnership grants. Next slide, please. All right, I think so. My apologies for a little bit over programming and aggressive timing there. With that, I think we'd be happy to answer questions. And I think, Patrick, you're going to facilitate that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kurt. And I know, obviously we did throw a lot at you. We will be following up the slide deck after this, and then I'm also going to put a message in the chat. If you would like just to me to directly email you a list of the all the links provided, just like the message that I sent in a second. So for the first question is, has the state considered measurements and goals related to not only reducing Massachusetts emissions, but our carbon footprint? It seems like it might be easier.
We've got 2 devices open and we've got a huge echo.
Oh.
Okay, if I think the question had to do with metrics and tracking. Could you, I'm sorry, it was quite echoey. Could you say that one more time?
Yeah, so I will fix this. Han, do you mind reading the question out loud?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the question is, has the state considered measurements and goals related not only to reducing emissions in Massachusetts, but our carbon footprint? It seems like it might be easier and cheaper to reduce carbon equivalent emissions generated in other places than go into products consumed in Massachusetts. Sorry, that go into products consumed in Massachusetts than the last residuals of emissions generated here.
The answer I would say is yes. We have a number of aspects, not necessarily in the natural and working space, although here as well, that relate to reducing product use. I hear you. I see that, Han. I didn't do anything different. I don't know why that would be.
No, that was letting Patrick know that he was echoing. That was not him.
Okay. So we, for example, in the there's emissions associated with solid waste. We have objectives of the Clean Energy and Climate Plan very much associated with reducing use, and we are more in this space looking at the carbon footprint of building products and construction techniques. So we know, for example, that some of the wood products have a lower emissions profile than concrete and steel, and so we'd be looking at some of those things. So I guess the answer is yes. That is known to us and something we are considering in various forms.
Now I'll just jump in that the emissions in our greenhouse gas inventory that are developed using IPCC guidance and EPA guidance are essentially emissions that are from the production in our the consumption in our state. So it's at this jurisdictional level, what's happening in our state, and so that is because of that emissions accounting approach. That's how we have to demonstrate compliance with net zero, is reducing emissions associated with what is produced in Massachusetts, what are emitted in Massachusetts. So while policy, like what Kurt has mentioned, is good to help reduce the life cycle emissions associated with a certain product, we are on the hook to reduce the emissions that is happening within our state border.
Another question, Han? You're muted now. Han, you're.
All right, I just want to check if everyone can hear me now. I did switch microwave. Am I still echoing or am I good? Okay, great. We did get asked to stop sharing the screen so we can see everyone speaking. So that's why I made the switch until the next presentation. So I will read out the next question, which is the requirement / goal to plant urban trees to be done by those cities or with some state partnership?
Combination. We're certainly have state employees, seasonal crews working to 8 of them at present across the Commonwealth. That is, we're also offering existing implementation and partnership grants and have other programs intended. So much as the Resilient Lands Coalition Bob spoke about requires a partnership, so does tree planting. This is not something the Commonwealth will do alone.
Great. All right, next is, I wonder if this report touched on relatively the newness of, quote, no management approach of this landscape. My understanding is that New England forests were heavily managed pre-colonization, and the hands-off approach to conservation land has dramatically changed the composition of our forested landscapes.
Yeah, this added to the challenge. So yes, the landscape of Massachusetts was largely deforested 100 years ago. The forests of Massachusetts have grown back over that period of time, which has led to a more even-aged and less diverse species-wise forest than would be the case if we had not cleared much of Massachusetts, say around prior to 1900 and in that vicinity where they forests started to grow back. And yes, that does influence. It was certainly talked about by the Climate Forestry Committee, what to do to achieve a species diversity, age diversity, given that history. And it is absolutely one of the challenges to picking a forest management strategy for the Commonwealth, not just state lands, but private lands as well.
Great, thank you. All right, next is, I'm also curious how indigenous land management techniques can be used in active management, whether their perspective was included in sustainable and justice-focused planning.
We have a number of ways in which we are presently engaging with indigenous organizations and indigenous individuals. And that is something we need to increase our focus on going forward. Certainly has been something the climate office here at Energy and Environmental, the Environmental Justice team has been focused on here at EEA. And I know, for example, the Department of Conservation and Recreation is working to retain someone specifically to work with indigenous populations. So a lot of wisdom to be gained from what indigenous people had been doing historically that could potentially be applied today in ways we're not presently recognizing. So there's a lot to that question and a lot of work to be done in that space.
Great, thank you. And then how does reducing forest fires enter into what you're planning?
Bob, did you want to jump in on that past question? Looked like you did.
Yes, just very quickly, just to point out that there's a tremendous amount of interaction and collaboration within the land trust community and indigenous nations across Massachusetts. And that's very promising. And I see that trend continuing to the conservation community writ large.
So Patrick, as to fire risk, I think was the question, more or less. What are we doing relative to fire on the landscape? Well, we do have some particularly fire-prone landscapes. I would cite the Pine Barrens of Southeast Mass as one of the more fire-prone in the Commonwealth. But we also know that that with drought and changing conditions, we have seen more prone conditions to fire. I presented on Forest as Climate Solutions to a combined meeting of the DCR Stewardship Council and the Fish and Wildlife Board a couple of weeks ago now, and this was a prominent topic on their minds. And I think what we committed to doing was going back and talking among state staff as we look to implement the recommendations of the committee and take into account all the public comment on this topic to speak to how potential fire risk is influencing our management choices. So it was honestly not prominent in the Climate Forestry Committee conversations, but has come up any number of times in settings since then.
And then the next one is that they're curious if it has been considered how MA residents, not just landowners, can become involved, responsible for, and connected to sustainable land management.
So Bob, maybe I'll start. You want to jump in on this one? So people who don't own land but are interested in land conservation, stewardship, and management, I think there's lots of ways to get involved. I think first of all of land trusts and engagement with your local land trust or with your conservation commission. But let me see what Bob would like to add to this one.
That was really it, Kurt, is just to say at the land trust level, there's a huge amount of activity. It's a quiet success story. The amount of volunteer work that's being done on reducing stressors on particularly on forested landscapes in Massachusetts by volunteers all across the state.
I would also say that political engagement is important. Lots of these things, whether it's at the local level, planning, zoning, creating management plans for a particular parcel owned by a municipality, that is something engaged citizens can really influence, and would encourage just broad engagement in climate change associated topics and natural and working lands management.
Great. All right. Next is they'd be interested in hearing what municipalities and others think are the greatest challenges or barriers to achieving conservation goals. I realize that's more of a discussion question, so we are going to move on to the next one. And it is, if a watershed association or Wild and Scenic Stewardship Council wanted to do a regional workshop covering these topics, especially with municipalities and private landowners, who should they coordinate with?
I would say there any number, the four of us, Han, Patrick, myself, Bob, any of us, I think we'll take your phone call and talk with you about that and see if we can arrange a time for engagement on these topics. I'd say broadly, we're willing. And we're part of a broad team. And as far as Forest's climate solutions, I would say there's probably 36 state employees pretty involved in sorting out various aspects of this. So we're certainly not alone, and we can draw on colleagues for some of these conversations.
Yeah, and double down on that. Please reach out to me with anything, anyone that needs connections to anything going on in the state, please reach out and I will connect you to the right people. And so the next one is pleased to see the mention of so many grant opportunities for land acquisition and for forest stewardship planning. Is there also grant money for municipalities to create or update land acquisition plans to prioritize and pursue important parcels within their boundaries?
So I guess I'll answer. My initial answer would be one thing that was not on the list is the state offers something called a land use planning grant, an annual offering available to municipalities and regional planning agencies. Any number of communities have done open space and recreation plans with those funds, but it also supports a variety of other types of planning. So at that scale, yes, there is grant money for applications for planning by municipalities.
And what I would add to
I
that,
also want to flag too that there have been some similar MVP projects that have detailed exactly what you outlined there. So I would also recommend reaching out to your local MVP regional coordinator.
and what I would add to your answers on that is that the capacity grant that I referenced that will be on the street soon, that will have a provision for municipalities to be able to hire consultants to help prepare open space and recreation plans.
Great, thank you so much. So unfortunately, I know we're pushing the timetable a little bit. I think we will circle back to a few questions or answer them in the chat as we go along. But seeing as it is 11:15, I do want to take the time. While you've heard a lot from the state, and we think it's really important to also hear from people that have, municipalities that have gone through these processes and successfully done action grants. So the second half of this presentation is really going to focus on a case study out of the Row MVP action grant. And so they have, really done a successful project in, natural and working lands. And we think it's important to highlight them. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andrew. If you believe you can introduce you and your team.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for the sake of time, we're going to introduce ourselves as we go, but I'm Andrew Randazzo. I'm a forest psychologist with Mass Audubon. I work on climate smart forestry, and we've been working with a number of communities to coordinate the Row Regional MVP grant alongside many partners. I am based in Greenfield, and that's the historic lands of the Pocumtuck and the Wabanaki, as well as the contemporary lands of the Nipmuc folks. And I'm excited. One of the things I'm excited to talk about, I know some questions came up about it, is how we've engaged with Indigenous communities around supporting Indigenous-led land stewardship as part of this work. But I'll get us started today. I want to acknowledge a couple people on that note that aren't here today. A couple folks couldn't be with us today who have done a lot of work. Part of what we'll be featuring is different partners and sort of their role. I know there's a lot of municipalities on the call, so hopefully that will give you some helpful ideas about how you might form sort of a collaborative regional MVP grant to increase sort of the scale and impact of your work. And Rhonda Anderson is one of those people that's missing from the Okateo Cultural Center. It's a intertribal cultural center based in Ashfield, and she's been really integral to this work in terms of helping us think through how to link this project with the Native community and folks who are locally engaging in Indigenous-led land stewardship. So just want to acknowledge Rhonda and all the work that she's done. And we'll cover some of sort of the content that she's focused on in her absence. And then I also want to acknowledge Lori Pike, who is, a member of the chair of the Roe Parks Commission, and has been really integral to this work, the formation of this grant, and her willingness to have this be a regional MVP grant so multiple communities could benefit was really noteworthy. And so I will give us an overview, a little bit of the grant, and then I'll talk about sort of climate smart forestry adaptation and mitigation so we can have a bit of a shared language around that. And then a couple of us will present on our sort of roles as partners in this grant, as well as some of the deliverables associated with the grant. So you can sort of get some ideas for projects that might help to meet all of these great natural climate solution goals that the state has at the community level. And so Patrick, if you can just go to the next slide. Okay, and so this is, I wanted to start off with the MVP plan, right? And so it all starts sort of with the plan, thinking about how you might open up opportunities here for your community to engage in climate smart forestry or planning for forest resilience or climate mitigation on your land. How is that currently in your plan? Or if you're updating your plan, how might you think about forest resilience? So this is an example from Roe's MVP plan, where they've identified their area of concern as the vulnerability of northern hardwood forests to specific climate change challenges and forest pests. And then one of their recommended solutions as part of that planning process was to implement their forest stewardship climate plan. You heard Kurt talk about those climate plans earlier, and the communities that we worked with on these grants already had climate plans. So a lot of what we focused on was engaging communities around sort of their options for implementation. And so one example of a management strategy here being underplanting red and white oak. So within the forest where it's understocked, there's not quite as much density of trees. Planting species that we know to be climate adapted to promote biodiversity and resilience. Next slide. So the goal really collectively of this work across municipalities and organizations was to deliver climate smart outcomes and build resilience through community engagement, open space planning, and forest stewardship climate plan implementation. And a key part of this work was our community liaison, the Ocotillo Cultural Center, who helped us to think through the ways that we should and maybe where it didn't quite make sense to link up with Indigenous people to integrate their views and help engage in Indigenous cultural revitalization as part of thinking about climate smart forestry and forest resilience. We engaged in this climate smart open space planning that Allison from FERCOG is going to talk about. How do we think about this at scales relevant to really having impact on resilience across a given area? These woods walks, which Emily Boss from the Mass Woodlands Institute and Franklin Land Trust is going to talk about, help to engage communities in understanding what's within their plans, understanding how the management actions might help to reach their goals for addressing climate challenges, and understanding what implementation might look like, feel like, and their options for that implementation. I'll talk about this virtual forest center development and our forest operational planning. So how do you take that outreach to an additional opportunity for learning and then sort of plan for action like we did with these grants? And of course, I just want to note monitoring. Monitoring is really important as part of this work. And we've worked, Mass Audubon in particular has worked with communities to collect baseline data on these forests so we can know how well this is working over time. Next slide. So before I go any further on this project, I want to just start with sort of a common understanding of how we refer to these terms. When we think about climate smart forestry, we're thinking about mitigation as well as adaptation. And the two are interlinked, right? So mitigation being this idea that forests soak up carbon dioxide and store it away as carbon. That sequestration is the soaking up, right? Trees are soaking up, particularly young trees are soaking up carbon. And then they're being, as that happens and as those trees mature, they're storing it away for long periods of time, helping to engage in a natural climate solution. Where we sit in Massachusetts within the northeastern woodlands, as Kurt showed on that one slide, we have a great deal of forest carbon already accumulated within our landscape. How do we sort of lock it away and protect it? And that's where adaptation comes in. As the extremes of climate change continue to unfold, how do we help forests to maintain sort of their health and well-being? And we often think about that through these different adaptation pathways. And broadly speaking, thinking about resilience, right? How do we help forests to bounce back as sort of the disturbances and stressors associated with climate change unfold? And in certain circumstances, plan for where that might not be possible. And all of this happens within the context of multiple goals that a community has for its forest: recreation, forest carbon, water quality, wood products, wildlife habitat. So it requires sort of careful planning and coordination. And that's why there really was a benefit to having so many partners and communities involved within this grant. Next slide. Uh-oh, this is supposed to be the last slide.
Sorry about that, Andrew.
That's okay. We lost our place, no worries.
All right, do you want to tell me right ahead?
Let's say the next slide should be the community resilience slide.
There we go.
No, back a little further. Right there. There we are.
So sorry about that. I don't know where I
Oh.
went.
Yeah, wait, it's still moving. Okay, I think we're good. Can everyone see the community resilience slide? Awesome. Okay, so sorry about that, folks, but just wanted to point out here that this is only a climate solution. Engaging in climate smart forestry and thinking about forest climate resilience is only a climate solution when we think about community resilience as part of this, right? So BIPOC people and low-income people in particular are at the forefront of the impacts of climate change. So how do we engage with this like MVP planning program and other grant initiatives that you just heard about through EEA in a way that sort of equitably restores access to land and involves these folks in making decisions for the land that they care about, right? And in this grant, we focused on that in terms of our Indigenous land stewardship focus, and really helping to think about Indigenous cultural revitalization. How can sort of engaging and supporting Indigenous communities and supporting Indigenous-led land stewardship lead us to better ecological outcomes collectively? And so we'll talk a little bit more about that specific work, but next slide. I just want to give you all a bit of a sense of who all was involved. So we had a number of towns that participated in this, including Rowe as the lead here, Keith, Conway. The Shelburne Falls Fire District participated from the perspective of both Shelburne and Buckland. And then through a matching grant, what's not on here is North Adams also participated, right? And there's a number of partners that help to sort of bring us all together and provide the support that's necessary. I have the Rowe Parks Commission bolded here because I know Lori wasn't able to be here, but you know, Rowe as a community has done a great deal of work to see this work forward. And you'll hear from a number of these partners on the next couple of slides. And I just want to acknowledge again that, you know, Rhonda Anderson from the Ocotillo Cultural Center has done some great work, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Lisa Hayden from the Woodlands Partnership of Northwest Massachusetts to cover the next slide.
Hello. Hi there. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, when you get to advancing to the next one, thank you. We appreciate the invitation to share our grant that has brought together so many partners to work in Northwest Massachusetts, which is, of course, the most forested corner of the Commonwealth. And so I'm Lisa Hayden, Outreach Director at New England Forestry Foundation. And since 2021, I've been serving also in the role as administrative agent for the Woodlands Partnership through a contract with the Commonwealth that our organization has. And so the Woodlands Partnership has 3 mission priorities. First, conserving and caring for forests amid a changing climate. Economic development that sustains both natural resources and people. So that includes activities such as sustainable forestry, tourism, and recreation in these communities, and supporting the fiscal stability of municipalities. And you may have heard of this collaboration as the Mohawk Trail Woodlands Partnership. But our board in 2022 voted unanimously to change its name to the Woodlands Partnership of Northwest Massachusetts, and has now requested the Commonwealth to officially recognize that new name in the state law that created the entity. And this decision came after hearing feedback from Indigenous peoples who feel the old name is a misappropriation of Indigenous culture, and it also did not reflect local tribal members who still live locally. And so the Woodlands Partnership has brought matching dollars to this grant through a 3-year U.S. Forest Service stewardship grant. And so that includes establishing demonstration forests where people can actually visit and see some of these climate smart practices on the ground. And it also includes community outreach to Indigenous partners. As Andrew was mentioning, the Ocotillo Cultural Center has been a key partner in this grant work and has also recently joined the partnership board as a voting member. And if you can please advance. Here in a minute, you'll see a map of the partnership region, which is, of course, including parts of Franklin and Berkshire counties. It's a 21-town area, of which 19 towns have officially opted in. And of course, this 2-year row grant was preceded by previous MVP grants to the towns of Adams and Williamstown, who are both members of the partnership. And so this geography has been serving as a pilot area with all of its diverse forest types to really learn about how these practices can be implemented. And the nonprofits that you're hearing from have been working together for several years on this effort. So as a public body, the Woodlands Partnership may be somewhat different from other regional planning entities around the state, but this grant project has really shown the benefit of towns working together. We're helping to identify common challenges in this region where the towns have limited tax bases and frequently a lack of local capacity to even implement grants like this. And of course, the response to climate change is an issue that overlaps town boundaries. So we really see a lot of opportunities to realize economies of scale through this work. And now I'm going to turn it over to Allison. Please advance the slide, thanks.
All right, hi, I'm Allison Gage. I'm a planner with the Franklin Regional Council of Governments, or the FRCOG. We're one of the 13 regional planning agencies in the state, and we're based in Greenfield and serve the towns of Franklin County, which is the most rural county in the state. Most of our towns do not have dedicated planning staff, so we provide technical assistance in a wide range of areas. And in the planning department, we do our best to go after grants to bring funding into the region and leverage those funds to keep important work going. However, managing grants can be a lot for a small town to take on, in addition to all of their other responsibilities. So for this project, the town of Rowe contracted with us to take care of the more administrative parts of it. So we were able to handle the procurement process for them, everything from preparing the RFP to reviewing applications to setting up the contracts, doing all of their reporting and billing. And on top of that, we were also able to do one of our more traditional planning activities, which is developing an open space and recreation plan. Additional funding from the MVP program allowed us to make it a little bit more than the traditional plan and make it more climate resilient. And you can go to the next slide. So my colleague Tamsin Flanders did a wonderful job with this. She worked with the town of Rowe on their first open space plan. They did not have one before this grant, so they were able to incorporate the recommendations of previous planning efforts, such as their Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Plan, their Hazard Mitigation Plan, and the Climate Smart Forest Stewardship Plan for Pelham Park. One of the interesting parts of this plan was looking at the unusually large amount of protected land that's owned by the town and the unusually large amount of protected land owned by utility companies such as the hydroelectric utility and the former nuclear plant. And by looking at the open space and recreation plan through the lens of climate change, the town is proactively planning to protect important resilient lands, preserve biodiversity, and preserve the health of the community. And the extra layer of analysis above the traditional OSRP, like Andrew mentioned, did more thinking about how the landscape may change over time, but how we can preserve important wildlife corridors, pollinator corridors, and more, and asking residents to engage with thinking about prioritizing efforts in support of climate resiliency. And another thing that we did was create an interactive story map. So we helped make this plan a little bit more accessible. These plans can typically be unwieldy, but we made this more interactive online so that folks could really engage with these ideas and yeah, just have more engagement with the maps and all the work that went into this. And with that, I'll turn it over to Emily Boss.
Hello, thanks so much. My name is Emily Boss. I work at Franklin Land Trust. I am Community Conservation Program Manager at FLT, a regional conservation organization, which has conserved over 35,000 acres in partnership over the past 3 decades. I'm also Executive Director of the Massachusetts Woodlands Institute. Oh, and if you can advance the slide, thank you. Let's see. Mass Woodlands Institute is a subsidiary of the Franklin Land Trust with a mission to support conservation, responsible stewardship of woodlands, and community and woodlands economy viability in Massachusetts. We partner with Mass DCR, Service Forestry on the Working Forest Initiative and Stewardship Program, and with many other private and public partners throughout the state and region. We're based in Shelburne Falls on the Pecumtuck, Mohican, Nipmuc, and Wabanaki land. And our first slide that I'll discuss, as Andrew had mentioned, is focusing on our partnership with the Ocotillo Cultural Center and other partners working with them. We've been working in partnership with the Ocotillo Cultural Center, which was founded in 2017 and is presently the only founded and run Indigenous Cultural Center in Western Massachusetts. We're grateful for the knowledge and experience they've shared, working together to have our project reflect goals of their mission, to uplift Native voices and dismantle unjust frameworks, working towards accessibility, equity, dignity, and wellness for Indigenous communities. As Andrew had mentioned, we worked closely with Rhonda Anderson, Inupiaq Athabascan from Alaska, Western Massachusetts, Commissioner on Indian Affairs, founder and co-director of the Ocotillo Cultural Center, and Native Youth Empowerment Foundation, as well as Andre Storm Bearhart Gaines Jr., who was the first artist in residence at the Ocotillo Cultural Center. He's a citizen of the Nipmuc people, serving as a cultural steward for his tribe, bringing traditional knowledge back to his Indigenous peoples, founder of his nonprofit No Lease Braids. Their work and others at Ocotillo Cultural Center have included being community liaisons, helping share the importance of traditional environmental knowledge and Indigenous presence on the land, convening relationship building woods walks, convening Indigenous forestry and land steward groups, participating in focus groups, and providing feedback on materials that are generated through this project, as well as conducting cultural literacy workshops for partners. Can you advance to the next slide? Ocotillo Cultural Center staff and No Lease Braids partners have led the way in community building and awareness raising for land trusts, municipalities, and state staff through woods walks and town forests, some of the demonstration properties that we've been working with to highlight in the Forest Center. And bringing together focus groups who can provide valuable viewpoint on the way that land is discussed and Indigenous presence is represented. They've hosted a training at Oakdale Cultural Center. Let's see, and on the history of war, land theft and dispossession, Indigenous land rights and movements in present communities. Their participation has helped us in regular meetings and providing context of people in Indigenous communities who can inform the work of the partnership. Can you advance to the next slide? My organization, the Mass Woodlands Institute, as I mentioned, is a nonprofit subsidiary of Franklin Land Trust. Our part of the MVP grant has been to help develop the Forest Center website materials and participate in community building, helping develop demonstration site materials and provide logistical support for meetings and virtual events. Can you advance to the next slide? A key component of the grant work that we've done has been to bring people together by walking on the land side by side and sharing perspectives and insights, considering forest stewardship from varying perspectives and hearing the voices of individuals engaged with the land. As we mentioned earlier, many of these woods walks were convened and participated in by members of the Oakdale Cultural Center. Partners such as municipal residents and boards and staff, Indigenous partners and environmental practitioners provided critical feedback on the materials of the Forest Center website through discussions on these walks, and then in addition, focus group meetings to review content and help provide a more full and truthful picture of the land, as well as creating understanding and connections between the partners. You can advance the slide and then go on to the next presenter.
Thanks, Emily. So as folks can see, there's a lot of people and organizations involved in this project, and we covered a lot of ground. And, you know, one of the things that I think was really important was hearing from the communities, both their needs, sort of as Lisa mentioned, for capacity and support in these grants via our organizations, but also sort of the identification of where we have like overlapping interests. And the Virtual Forest Center is one place where that can sort of all come together. So through the Woodlands Partnership's vision for in-person forest center and the community's sort of need for additional education, and when we were engaging in woods walks and outreach events prior to this grant, we really heard from folks about the need to have a place to learn more and to dive deeper, because making decisions about engaging with land stewardship is complex and requires sort of like deeper consideration. So we've been building this Forest Center of Northwest Massachusetts as a virtual forest center resource for communities to really complement real life opportunities to learn about caring for our forests into the future, and to connect communities with supporting resources that allow them to examine their options for forest stewardship on that spectrum from passive to active and wildlands and woodlands that we've talked about earlier in this webinar. And it will also eventually help to connect folks into our demonstration sites, including the one in Rowe that I'm about to talk about. And so the Forest Center really is a great opportunity for all of the communities to for all the municipalities on this call to maybe tap in and learn about a bit more about how they might think about forest resilience in their projects. And we'll be having a launch event in June, and we're happy to share more details on that once we have it. We'd love for you all to sort of attend that and learn more about the resource. Next slide. And so this ultimately at the end of the day is an action grant. So how do we help communities to get to implementation? And through this action grant, we were working with a bunch of different communities, as I mentioned, and everyone was sort of at a different place, right? So largely we use this outreach opportunity and the stakeholder engagement process as a way to have conversations and plan for the next step. And for a couple of communities, including Row, that included a climate smart operational plan and working with foresters, and partners on this call to help the community actually plan out what the implementation of their forest stewardship climate plans might look like and how they might be able to demonstrate those that work to their communities and landowners within their communities, as well as members of the public who are just interested in learning more about the care of forests. So Row has done a great amount of work, excuse me, around caring for Pelham Lake Park and working towards implementing that municipal vulnerability preparedness plan goal of addressing resilience within Pelham Lake Park. And that includes things like establishing an old growth trail, treating white ash, monitoring eastern hemlock, and planting climate adapted trees. And then this operational plan really focused on the next steps and the proposed idea here being 2 side-by-side patch cuts that are pretty small scale, but would help to address one of Pelham Lake Park's biggest vulnerabilities, which is a lack of regenerating or establishing young trees. The slash wall in particular is a great opportunity to address another vulnerability, which is the high level of herbivory because of the high deer population in the park. And so a slash wall is these big, large, woody debris walls that are constructed and biodegrade over time, but allow the young plants and trees to establish enough so that they can avoid sort of the impacts of, or the worst impacts of herbivory. Next slide, please. So that's a lot for a community to think about, and it's hard to make decisions about harvest and the implementation of forest stewardship. But ultimately, what we heard from the community is that they wanted to care for Pelham Lake Park around promoting forest resilience, thinking about climate change, and that they were really interested in education, research, and outdoor recreation opportunities, and to be a part of that project. And that's why sort of this demonstration forest project felt like a good fit for Row, and we're still sort of in the public input and learning process of that. But this plan that we talked about, this operational plan that we talked about and built with them, helped to progress that conversation. And ultimately, the project provides them a number of opportunities to actually address and implement their MVP plan recommendations, including implementing that forest stewardship climate plan, promoting wildlife habitat and forest ability to cope with climate change, and engaging in this demonstration process that brings the community's values around education, outdoor recreation, and research and monitoring to the table. And next slide. This is a picture of a slash wall and the woody debris and a patch cut. I'll admit that it's made prettier by the beautiful fall foliage. These things can be a little shocking to people to see on the ground because it's a pretty drastic change. But I guess the beauty that I see in it is the innovation that communities are engaging with and thinking about the care of their forests to address these challenges that are so relevant to climate change, including just making sure that we have a diverse structure and young tree establishment in forested ecosystems, and those challenges are pretty strong in our region. There's a map here that sort of just shows what was one of the elements of the operational plan that helped to further that community conversation about implementation. And I think I just have one more slide here. I know we've thrown a lot at you all, and this project really covered a lot of ground, and I think that was enabled by our collaboration across communities and across organizations. And there's just some important things for us to all be thinking about as we're building grants like this, and thinking about the MVP plan in particular. forests, in addition to the built infrastructure, have to be a part of that planning effort. How do you think about forest adaptation as part of your MVP planning effort? And partnerships really take time to build across communities and across organizations, but they really do enable scale, and that sort of meets the scope, the drastic nature of the climate challenge, right? But there's also the reality of needing to move at the speed of trust and adapt accordingly. Community and public input is really important. And thinking in our project's case about our Indigenous partners, that work has just sort of moved on a different timeline than the rest of our deliverables. And that was really so that we can engage in that relationship building and make the right decisions about next steps. And the reality is that while MVP grants are 1 to 2 years, that's not the time frame of climate adaptation. It's much longer. So these represent, really awesome opportunities to have important conversations and implement key steps that help you to continue to plan for the future. Happy for us to take any questions on all of this, and I think folks from this team maybe can put their contact information in the chat, and Patrick has our contact information as well if anyone wants to follow up after. But thank you all so much for your time.
Yeah, Andrew, thank you so much. I think it's really important to highlight how much collaboration went into this project to this. And I think it's just important for us all, getting together on this webinar. We need to engage with each other to create these successful projects. So thank you guys so much for sharing. I haven't seen anything in the chat, but please, anyone, toss any questions that you have. It's important, to communicate. So ask these questions if you.
Check your audio. It's not coming through. Still can't hear you.
I'm so sorry, everyone. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about the technical difficulties. I am in a different room than I usually am today. One question was, what can the EEA do to help all the municipalities in the NW Woodlands partnership, including removing the financial barriers we face as small owns? I think this would certainly be, I would suggest, reaching out just to your regional coordinator. We need to start the conversation. So I know out in Western Mass, it is Emma Sass, who I know she put her email in there this morning. But for something we can follow up with, I can also send in our directory to the chat. I think for small towns, just reach out to whoever the regional coordinator is, and then we can work together to make a plan. Because I know it's important to make specific plans depending on every different area. So I also see that you have 2 different regional coordinators. Please reach out to both of them, and we'll find out how to do it. And also follow up with me, and I will find the right contact as well. And I am just quickly sharing in the chat our staff directory as well. And then just want to open it up again before we, wrap up. We have our community comments and idea considered. And is that a question for Andrew?
I can try to take that one. I guess I guess we'd have to collectively define what we mean by community commons for me to answer that well, I think. Community forests have been, an important part of thinking about climate solutions. And so how do we collectively use and share that space is an important part of the conversation. How we've sort of worked with our work as a partnership has been with communities, focusing on providing municipalities with that support to get to implementation. I know I see Tricia is sort of pointing out that there's some key concerns in terms of getting to implementation for municipalities. And so that's what we try to work with communities on, is getting over some of those barriers, and MVP and EEA have been great partners on that. And part of that conversation, that public outreach conversation, that stakeholder conversation, is led by the communities. What do you all see as the important considerations for your community? And certainly the way we use and interact with municipal and community forest spaces is an important part of that conversation, and becomes even more important when we start to think about land dispossession for Indigenous peoples. So having more shared land access is really important. I don't know if anybody else has something they'd like to add to that.
No, thank you, Andrew. That's very helpful. And then I know another comment that we got was that people would like to engage in larger projects, but are limited by the match. This is something that the MVP team is working on, and the director, Kara, has put in the comments here that we'll likely have some updates to the match for the next round of MVP. So please just stay up to date with that. And there will be the pre-RFR sessions next week for more details.
Yeah, and Emily Boss put a great comment in there, just highlighting the Community Forest Stewardship Grant that DCR offers. That grant is really easy for communities to apply to. Like, it's one of the easiest grant applications I've ever seen. And it's a 75-25. So there's a 25% match, but the in-kind in terms of staff time and forest stewardship can make it basically like a $0 match grant. It is focused on municipalities that have a stewardship plan. And so getting that stewardship plan is the first step. And there is cost share available for that through DCR as well.
Great. So as we are, coming to the end of time, I do just want to put in a plug here to sign up for our newsletter and our email list. We're going to be, planning to do more events like this in the future, and just more, providing more detailed information for everyone so we can, engage more and learn more. So please sign up, and we can get you the right information and resources that you need for your municipality. Yeah, I just want to, unless anyone has anything else that they want to mention, I want to thank everyone for joining here today. I think this has been very helpful to share, experiences from an MVP action grant, but also from the EEA climate and environmental team.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.
All right. Well, with that, thank you, everyone. And please, if you have any questions after this, follow up with me at patrick.forde, FORDE, @mass.gov. We really appreciate everyone joining us today. Have a great day.
Thanks, Patrick.